Welcome to Hear Me Out, where armchair quarterbacks reign supreme. Around here, we're not experts, only lifelong friends who love sports and love arguing about them. Make sure to tell us why we're right, why we're wrong, or why we're all morons in the comments below. Today, we'll start by discussing whether a trade should be judged based on the time it happens or a few years down the road. We'll start with you, Jesse.
Okay, so to me personally, clearly the trade should be judged a few years down the road. Because if you judge it, it's like judging a TV series after watching the first episode. If you're going to judge it right when it happens, because especially you have sports like baseball, right, where you have major players traded every year at the trade deadline for prospects. I mean, and you're going to judge the trade at the time it's done when the prospects haven't even played a game in the league yet. You could trade it for the number one, number two prospects in the game. They never make the lead, or you could trade it for prospects that are outside the top 100. They come to the league and tear it up like Mike Trout. We had the trade David Johnson that Josh said was a bad trade at the time. Everyone said it was a bad trade at the time. He looked pretty decent in his first week with his new team. And DeAndre Hopkins is DeAndre Hopkins, obviously. But if, say, David Johnson tears it up this league, are you still going to tell me that that's a bad trade?
I would. Yeah, I would. I think, to me, in my opinion, whenever a trade is made, there's a lot of circumstances that surround it. So you have information about the players who are being traded. If there's picks, salary cap, there's a lot of implications that go into a trade other than just the players. And you know about most of those things at the time. And so there are some trades that maybe one team is giving up way too much and not getting enough in return. And most people would say that's a bad trade. And it may work out. Maybe the player they gave away who's supposed to be really good gets a big injury, and the guy they bring in who wasn't supposed to be that good somehow ends up really good. Things like that happen. But at the time, with all information that those teams had to work with, it wasn't a good trade. And everything that you had to look at would indicate that the trade wouldn't work out, making it, in my opinion, a bad trade.
But giving up too much at the time based on what? Based on what parameters that did you give up too much? How can you know that before you see what you actually gave up? Like if you trade Tom Brady, I know he signed with the Bucks, but if the Patriots traded Tom Brady for Cam Newton to the Panthers or whatever, how can you judge that at the time? You don't know if he gave up too much. What if Cam Newton was too much? Because what if Cam Newton doesn't pan out?
Well, trading the greatest quarterback to ever play the sport of football for a quarterback who's been pretty up and down, mostly due to injuries over the last few years, I think most people would consider just a flat out bad trade for the Patriots perspective.
The 43-year-old version of the greatest quarterback. So we're not talking about trading Brady in his prime here.
Yeah, and in that example, you can maybe make that argument, but I could point out the Herschel Walker trade where they, let me check my notes, gave up 5 players and 6 draft picks for 1 running back. I don't care if Herschel Walker rushes for 4,000 yards a season for the next 14 years. That's a stupid trade. How could you give up that much for 1 player? I don't care what the return is. It makes no sense. It was a bad trade.
What if the return is 2 titles? What if the return is three NFL championships? What if that's the return on it? Is that still a bad trade?
It was a bad trade that worked out. It ended up working out in the long run, but it still was not a good trade.
But how can it be a bad trade that worked out? Isn't that just a good trade? If it works out, isn't that the definition of a good trade?
No, it's a bad trade that worked out. Versus, say, you make a good trade, like, for instance, Arizona's perspective in that DeAndre Hopkins, David Johnson trade we were talking about a second ago. Almost anyone would say Arizona won that trade because Arizona gets arguably the best wide receiver in the entire National Football League, and Houston gives up one of the most overpaid running backs who hasn't finished a season in 3.5 years. And DeAndre Hopkins blows out his knee in his first year, blows out his other knee in the second year, dislocates a shoulder in the third year, and breaks his ribs in the fourth year, and now he's off a contract. Things like that could happen, and I don't think it's fair to say, oh, well, then the Cardinals made a bad trade, because every indicator at the time said this is a great trade. It just didn't work out. That doesn't make it a bad trade.
Let's ignore injuries. What if he just underperforms? What if he's not comfortable in Phoenix? What if he's not comfortable playing in Cliff Kingsbury's system? What if he's not comfortable with Kyler Murray as his quarterback and he just underperforms? That's not an injury thing where it's just unlucky. That's just he didn't play well. We have players fall off all the time. So how are you going to say it's still a good trade if he goes to that system and he's just not the player he was? Meanwhile, you have Bill O'Brien who gets David Johnson, and all of a sudden he knows what to do with them. He puts David Johnson back in the all-purpose leaderboards that he was, 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, and things like that do happen. But again, you have to go off of, because it's all about the information you have at the time. The same logic
But
can be
what if your
applied.
information was flawed? What if you think so? You think Arizona won the trade, but what if Arizona's information was flawed? Like DeAndre Hopkins isn't good in that system. I'm not saying he's not, but what if he isn't
Right.
good in that system with Kyler Murray and Cliff's system? So their information could be flawed at the time. Did they still win that trade?
Well, I think that there can be some subjectivity on what is a good trade and what's a bad trade, right? I mean, I think a trade, some people would say is good, other people would say it's bad because information could be interpreted differently. So I'm sure
Fair.
some Houston Texans thought they won that trade because of DeAndre Hopkins' contract, for instance. So some Texans were happy to have made that trade.
Well, every front
Uh,
office thinks they win every trade. Let's get that. No one
right, of
trades
course,
something
yeah.
knowing it's a bust. Unless you're Bill Belichick and you're trading Jimmy Garoppolo out of spite, no one's making a trade knowing it's a bust.
and you can
Every
do that
front
when
office
you're
is
Bill
thinking they won the
Belichick.
trade.
But no, and you're right. Every
You can
front
do that
office
when you have Tom Brady and you put no personnel around him for 21 years.
for 21 years and let him win all your titles. Right, you can do that. But like I said, there's some subjectivity to trades. And so it's not necessarily that there's this concrete defined like, oh, this team won the trade because of these metrics. I think if you examine everything and at the end of it, you feel, okay, this was a good trade because this, you can back it up and you believe it, then I think 4 years down the road, say the trade didn't pan out, that doesn't mean it was a bad trade at the time. And like I was saying, it could apply to like draft picks, the same logic as with trades. You know, when the Jaguars took Justin Blackmon 5th overall, he's one of the best college wide receivers I've ever seen in my life. He was an
Don't
unstoppable
draft don't
football
draft Big 12 wide receivers. Don't draft
That's
Big 12 wide receivers.
that's fair. That's fair, but a different topic. But the point is he's one of the best college receivers I've ever seen in my life. The production,
Fair,
the
fair.
talent, skill set, everything unbelievable. And Jaguars needed offense so bad. When he gets drafted, he was arrested once or twice before he even played his first preseason game. Didn't play well on the field. Got suspended. Ends up out of the league after I think his second season, third. I'd have to go and check to make sure. There was no person on the planet who could have looked at that before they took Justin Blackmon and said, oh, yeah, he's going to bust out because he won't stop getting caught for drugs and getting suspended. No one would have guessed that. He was never even suspended for a game in college. It just didn't work out. It was
What
still
about
a
free
great
agency
draft pick.
signings? What about free agency signings? What if you sign a free agent, everyone calls it a good signing at the time, he doesn't perform for you? Ask the Los Angeles Angels if signing Albert Pujols for $500 million 13 years ago was a great deal when he's now on the roster for 4 more years, set to make $41 million, and he hasn't been a good player in a decade.
All right. Let's wrap up the arguments. Make your final couple points.
Go ahead, Josh.
Well, on that last one, I was just going to say, I think a lot of people saw how much they paid Albert Pujols and said that's way too much, even for as good of a player as he was suspected to be. But, I mean, at the end of it all, I think that the way the trade ends up shouldn't necessarily reflect whether it was good or bad. I think you should operate more on the logic that was used at the time of the trade.
I'm going to err on the side still that you can't judge a trade at the time because you don't know. Even you could have the best information in the world. You don't know how that player is going to play for that other team. You don't know how those players that you get back are going to play for your team. So I don't think you can judge a trade till at least 3 years. You got to give it at least 3 years.
That's fair. That's fair.
I think trades definitely should be judged at the time they're made based off the current market value of the players traded, the picks traded, that sort of thing. But I think it's important to be able to look back at trades that happened and say whether or not they truly worked out, and then you can kind of change your perspective based on the outcome of the trades down the line. But we'll go ahead and move on. We're going into the world of football with this next topic. We're going to discuss, is a running back overly important to a team's overall success?
Go ahead,
Go
Josh.
ahead. Start, Josh.
All right. So this is a very layered issue, and there's a lot of points and arguments you could bring up. And I think the biggest argument people would bring up against running backs is if you look at all the previous Super Bowl winning teams, they
Do you have my notes in front of you right now?
I do not have your notes in front of me, but I know where you're going with this. If you look at the last, because I looked at it too, probably I think 10 Super Bowls. I think 8 of the last 10 were won by elite quarterbacks with not a good running back on the roster. And I think that's a fair point, because I think at the end of the day, quarterback's the most important position in football, and having an elite quarterback is more important than having an elite anything else. And that's what I will start with, and I know that we will both agree on that point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
From there, though, I would say that having a good running back is really important to an offense, because even if you don't win a Super Bowl, you look at the team who was in the Super Bowl with the Chiefs last year and lost because of quarterback play. They have 4 running backs who could legitimately start for.
So what you're saying is the running back play wasn't important. Go on.
When your quarterback plays poorly enough, no, it doesn't. But it does so much for an offense to have a good running back, and I think a good running back can have a lot of facets, right? Because there's pass protection, catching the ball out of the backfield, things like that, aside from just running the ball, that even the teams with bad running backs but good quarterbacks, those running backs are still able to do those things. It opens up passing lanes for the quarterback. It pulls the defense forward so that the quarterbacks can play better. It's definitely a good thing and very important, in my opinion, to have a good running back on your football team.
So let me start with making a differentiation here. Running game, running back. Having a solid running game, super important to open up the passing game. Having a top running back does not matter. Tell me when the last Super Bowl champion to have an all-pro running back on their team was, Josh.
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Marshall Faulk, 1998. We have had, 40 all-pro running backs, and none of them have won a Super Bowl in the year they were an all-pro. None. Tell me, what is Adrian Peterson, LaDainian Tomlinson, Ezekiel Elliott, Todd Gurley, all the great running backs from the last decade, what do they have in common? 0 rings. Having a running back's the most overpaid position. Ezekiel Elliott, I'm a huge Zeke fan, the most overpaid player on the Cowboys until they're going to sign Dak Prescott. Having a top running game is important. If you look at the years that the Patriots won the Super Bowl recently, they had a decent running game. You couldn't name a single, not you, but in general, people couldn't name a single running back on those squads. James White, he was more of a pass back than a running back. Having a solid running game is mostly about the offensive line anyway, opening up pass blocking. It's more about the scheme from the offensive coordinator, having a good run options, having a good quarterback with the play action, having a quarterback that's a threat to go downfield so the DBs can't cheat in. Having a solid running back as an individual is only going to get you an overpaid position, probably an underpaid quarterback, and an underdeveloped offense.
I think those are all really good points, and I agree with you that running back's one of the most overpaid positions in football for sure. And a big distinction for me as well is that I would not argue for a high paid running back or a major free agent running back, like the Le'Veon Bells, the Ezekiel Elliott's, the ones who make a ton, the Christian McCaffrey who just signed for a ton of money. I think
but if you're going to go out there and get a good running back, you're going to have to chalk up the pay. No running back's going to, especially with Le'Veon Bell sitting out, Ezekiel Elliott sitting out, resetting the market every year for the running backs. You're going to have to chalk up for a good running back.
Well, and I think that, like I said earlier, a good running back is such a multifaceted thing, because if you have a player who goes out there, they hand him the ball, he's really good at finding the creases, he hits the holes, he never picks up less than 3 yards a carry. Super reliable, good in pass protection, solid pass catcher, a guy that isn't a household name. He's not the guy who signs for $75 million over 4 years like Alvin Kamara and those guys. That to me is still a good running back. Like Aaron Jones in Green Bay. How many people talk about Aaron Jones? Not that many people, but he's
less than people should.
Less than people should, I agree, because he's a great running back, and that's what he does so much for that Green Bay offense. He does so.
Can you remind me who the quarterback is in Green Bay?
Aaron Rodgers.
There we go. Go on.
Yeah, and like I said, we agreed that a quarterback is the most important position in the league, but
in sports, period.
In sports, I would agree with that, and so just because you're not resetting the market with your free agent deal like Le'Veon Bell doesn't mean you're not a good running back. And I think there are a lot of running backs who don't get enough credit because they get overshadowed by guys like Todd Gurley and Christian McCaffrey. But you go back to the quarterback or the teams that won Super Bowls that didn't have the elite quarterbacks, like the last one, the Baltimore Ravens with Joe Flacco, who I know there
Playoff
was
Joe is elite.
uh,
Playoff Joe is elite.
you could argue that Playoff Joe is elite. I wouldn't because he's never been elite any other minute of his life.
All
Uh,
you need is the playoffs.
but they had Ray Rice, who I know he wasn't an all pro, but that goes to my point. He wasn't an all pro. He wasn't the highest paid running back in the league. He wasn't a big, huge dollar free agent signing, but he was still one of the better backs in the league between catching
But
passes, running the ball, pass blocking, things like that.
But that's the point. So like in baseball, they have an idea of a WAR, right? Where it's wins above replacement. So you take your player, you replace him with an average replacement level player, and how many extra wins does he get you? I think Pro Football Focus ran a similar stat, and running backs across the board had the lowest WARs. Just because if you have a guy like Ray Rice, who you just admitted he's not an all-pro level, he's not a great running back, he's a decent running back. You could call him a good running back. If
Mhm.
you replaced him with an average running back, I bet you the Ravens are still in the same place. They still have the same offensive line. They still have playoff Joe, who's a legend, despite what you say. They still have who was the coach at the time? John Harbaugh, who was a great coach, or Jim, whatever one of the twins it was.
John. It's
John. John Harbaugh, who's a great coach. They still have that team intact. How much of that? So the two universally agreed upon greatest running backs of all time, I argue it's Eric Dickerson, but the two that everyone says, Barry Sanders and Emmitt Smith. Barry Sanders is 1,000 times the back that Emmitt Smith was, but which one of them has rings and which one of them is always at the top of every record? It's Emmitt Smith because he had, 4 Hall of Fame linemen his whole career?
Yeah.
So is he a product of the offensive line, or is he really that good of a back?
No, he was a product of the offensive line for sure. And so I agree that a running back's not going to carry a team for sure. But I think it's very important and very helpful to have a good running back in your system that can facilitate whatever you're trying to do on offense, right? What Tom Brady needs from Ronald Jones Jr. in Tampa Bay is not the same thing that Matthew Stafford needs from Kerryon Johnson in Detroit. But having a good running back that fits your team needs and is good in that role is important to a team. And any of the elite quarterbacks will tell you how important their running back is to their team's success. Now, should you have a good running back for 4 years and instead of signing him, you let him walk and take another 5th-round running back who fits your system? All signs point to that's the better strategy than paying a lot of money for a running back. But
Thank you for making my point.
You're very welcome.
All right. Take the next little bit to make your last gut punches of your arguments, and we'll move on.
My last gut punch is this, like exactly like Jacob said, or Josh said. You're having great success with your running back. His contract ends. Get rid of him. Get another back. They're replaceable. The most replaceable position is the running back in football. They're a dime a dozen.
I agree with that, but with a lot of teams with a great running back, okay, they need breathers. The backup comes in. What happens to all those great offenses as soon as their great running back comes off the field? They start to stall every time. You can tell the difference in the offense when the backup back is in the game versus the starter. Could it be game planning? Maybe, but the point is the offense runs way better with the elite back than the guy who is a backup.
I think the evidence overwhelmingly points that an all-star running back doesn't breed a ton of success for teams if they lack in other important areas. You look at the Fournette-led Jaguars, the Elliott-led Cowboys, very minimal amounts of success. And who do you have winning Super Bowls? James White-led Patriots, whoever the heck led Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, it just isn't. It doesn't appear to be a necessary thing and even an overly helpful thing, and their shelf life. It really ruins teams a lot of times when you overinvest in a top tier running back. But moving on from that, for the main topic is go on to discuss who the greatest American athlete of all time was. The important caveat: American athlete, North American athlete. This isn't a global topic. We'll start with you, Jesse.
So to me, you have to define greatness first. So you see it on Twitter all the time that Michael Jordan played against plumbers. We have to define greatness first. So greatness to me is how good you were in comparison to your peers at the time. So just because you played in the 1940s or something doesn't mean you're not as great of an athlete. With that being said, the answer for the greatest American athlete in history is Barry Bonds. The only answer to the greatest athlete in history is Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds put up numbers that are video game like. Barry Bonds put up numbers that are almost unbelievable when you go down his stat sheet. Barry Bonds was the most feared batter, athlete to ever step on a field. Barry Bonds would get 1 to 2 hittable pitches a night, and he would crush them both. Barry Bonds had an elite eye. He had an elite in the field, 9 gold gloves, one of the top outfielders of all time. His arm was decent, wasn't great, wasn't bad. He played left field, didn't need it. Obviously the greatest hitter of all time. There's no athlete I can think of that dominated his sport in a way that Barry dominated his sport. And that to me is greatness. That is the greatest American athlete of all time. Take it away.
Okay, well, I think that there could be a lot of people who would have been the greatest American athlete of all time if they had as much assistance as Barry Bonds did on his way to achieving his greatness. But my vote for the greatest American athlete of all time would be Jim Thorpe, a guy who admittedly played sports at a time when sports was very different. But this is a guy who won 2 Olympic gold medals as a track athlete, played professional football in the NFL and the league that preceded the NFL. He played professional baseball. He played professional basketball. He was a competitive dancer in college. I have never seen one individual be such a well-rounded athlete, because the term athlete is someone who participates in athletics. It's not a guy who plays a sport. It's a guy who participates in athletics. And I've never seen a guy, again, I know the times were different back then. I mean, he played in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but no one has ever played that many professional sports at the level he did. He didn't just go out there and, was a slouch at half the sports, but he made the teams. He was a legitimate threat in every single sport he played, and that's never been done before, and it's never been done since.
But see, as a caveat, Barry Bonds is also an all-state basketball and football player in high school. But
High school.
You're saying it hasn't been done since. Jim Thorpe, as great as he was, made a Pro Bowl or whatever the equivalent was, I think back in the 20s in football. He wasn't a great baseball player by any means. He had like 138 hits in his career and batted 250. He wasn't a great basketball player by any means. I don't think he ever started for any teams. He made the teams. He was a great athlete. He was a multi-talented athlete, but he wasn't a jack of all trades. He was kind of a good at everything, great at nothing kind of player. You might say he was great at football. Maybe that's his one. But Bo Jackson did it better. Bo Jackson was an all-star in baseball, could have been on a Hall of Famer with how much power he had if he didn't blow out his hip. And he was a Pro Bowl running back. He was I would argue during the 84 season, he was one of the best running backs in the league, as unimportant as they are. But
right.
So you have Deion Sanders did it better too. Deion Sanders played baseball. He was a decent player. He wasn't great. And he was the greatest defensive player of all time, not named Lawrence Taylor. So, I mean, you say we haven't seen it since. I think we have seen it since. They didn't go play basketball too, but you had Charlie Ward for Florida State, won a Heisman, and then went and played in the NBA. So I think we've seen it since, and I think we've seen it better, as great as he was.
I think we've seen it since to an extent. You got Michael Jordan, who was a great basketball player,
Terrible
and then went on and he attempted to play baseball. I mean, a lot of the guys you mentioned, they played one sport that they were good at and then had another that they were also good at. Jim Thorpe was on a professional team for 4 different sports and was an Olympic gold medalist for a different sport. He wasn't a great football player who had a pretty impressive baseball career for being a football player on the side. I mean, he was a legitimate professional athlete in 5 different sports. Yes, there's guys who've been dual sport athletes, and that's happened. But 5? An Olympic gold medal winner? I mean, it's like if Michael Phelps was also a top 5 quarterback in the league and is also one of the better baseball players in the MLB.
Well,
and
we're talking about 5 sports in a time when there were 10 pro leagues for every sport. I know he played in the NFL. He played in the top. He played in the MLB for a tiny, tiny little bit, but he's played in a lot of other professional baseball leagues. I mean, making a professional sports team, there was a baseball had a 4'8" guy that made a professional sports team back then. Making a professional sports team isn't the end all be all. And to go with the Olympic medal thing, Deion Sanders and Bo Jackson, both their college track times would have been Olympic gold medalists back in the 20s or 1910s. They both had Olympic speed. They couldn't because they went pro. Jim Thorpe even had his vacated because he went pro too early. They gave him back in the 80s, but they went pro early. They couldn't compete in the Olympics, but they had Olympic speed too. And you're talking about a time now where players specialize in sports. So you don't like I said about Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds was great at basketball, and he was great. He might not have played football in high school. He might have played in junior, but he was great at basketball too. He's a great player. But he dedicated to baseball, and he dominated baseball in a way that no one has ever dominated their sport ever in history. Michael Jordan was dominant. LeBron James was dominant. Wilt Chamberlain was dominant. Nobody's dominated a sport like Barry Bonds dominated sport. He's hit a level that's never been hit in any other sport by any other pro athlete. And that's greatness to me, when you can look at him and say, nobody has ever done to other pro athletes what Barry Bonds did to other pro athletes. Jim Thorpe played a lot of sports, and he did a lot of things well, but he never dominated any of those sports. He was never out there. I know Dwight Eisenhower called him the best athlete he ever saw, but he was never out there setting records, dominating the sport. Barry Bonds was dominating the sport in an insane way. That was so laughable. They had a perjury jury in Congress based on how much he dominated the sport.
Right. And I think that's all very fair. And without a doubt, Barry Bonds was a great baseball player, probably the best of all time, and one of the best athletes we've ever seen. But a big distinction with Jim Thorpe, in my opinion, you mentioned that now athletes are a lot more focused nowadays versus back then, which is why you see so many great athletes focus on one sport. But also at the same time, pro sports was way less of a thing back then. I mean, kids weren't growing up dreaming of being professional football players in the 1890s when Jim Thorpe was doing it. Barry Bonds probably wanted to be a professional Major League Baseball player since he was old enough to know what Major League Baseball was.
His dad was a Major League Baseball player, so yeah, he grew up in the clubhouse.
Right. That's how things are today. A lot of these pro athletes that are in the league right now have been playing their sport since they were 5 years old, maybe younger, maybe a little older. There are cases where that's not true, but we get kids started so young now, and that's the dream for a lot of people, and they go on to do that. Professional sports was not a career path. That wasn't viable. It was hard to live as a professional athlete, and Jim Thorpe did it anyway at a time when people weren't doing it in all of those sports. That great of an athlete at a time when people weren't really athletes. They didn't do it because you needed a job, you needed to make money, you needed to work hard at the time that they lived in. You didn't have time for sports. And he was a great athlete. You talked about comparing people to their peers at the time, and the people he was playing with weren't really athletes. You could use that to argue against him, saying, of course he was so good because the people he played against sucked, but at the same time, that means he should have too.
I don't believe that. Yeah, I dismissed it at the beginning.
Absolutely. And so the fact that he was that much better of an athlete than every other person in our country at any sport he played, that is unbelievable to me. And yes, Barry Bonds was a great baseball player, and I'm sure he was a good athlete playing a couple different sports in high school. And he was head and shoulders above everyone else in the Major League Baseball, in the MLB at the time, and I'll concede that. But he would not have walked onto an NFL team and been a top 10 NFL player, and he would not have gone and joined an Olympic track team and been a top 5 player. He would not have been able to do any of those things. Jim Thorpe was playing, a LeBron James level athleticism at any sport he stepped in. No, his baseball numbers weren't great. Not all of his numbers were great, but to be that competitive in so many different sports, I really believe we've never seen that since him.
But it comes down to
any final thoughts? Go ahead and start making those now.
So it comes down to me to what you define as greatness. So you're saying because he played a lot of sports, he had a lot of hands in a lot of cookie jars, that he was a greater athlete. And that's true. He was a great athlete. He had a lot of different things going on. He was good at a lot of different sports. Some say he was one of the best college football players ever. He's decent in the NFL. I think he made the equivalent of the Pro Bowl back then once. Mm-hmm. Never a great MLB player, never a great basketball player, but he played those pro as well. I'm defining greatness as how much better are you than your peers. So yeah, he was good. He was never the best football player in the world. He was never the best basketball player. He's never the close to the best baseball player in the world. Barry Bonds was the best baseball player in the world by a larger margin than anyone else outside of Babe Ruth back in the 20s for 15 to 16 years before he started deteriorating in his couple early years. But for a 15 to 16 year stretch, he was head and shoulders and legs and feet the best baseball player in the world. And we haven't seen that outside of maybe LeBron James in basketball.
That's fair. And I would give you that. I kind of made a joke alluding towards it at the beginning, but it's impossible for me to obviously not bring up the scandal tied to his name. And the frustrating thing about that to me is he was playing well before he was ever connected.
He didn't need it. He was already an all-time great before it.
He didn't need it. But he still did it, and that's something to me, I can't just totally let that go. That's something that I also think of when I think of Barry Bonds, a bit of a blemish on his record. The only thing Jim Thorpe had similar to that was when he had his gold medals taken away, because at the time you couldn't compete in the Olympics and be a pro athlete at the same time. It's not a rule anymore. That's why his medals are back. But at the time, that's how that worked. That's the closest thing to a scandal he's ever had. And being such a well-rounded athlete, I've conceded, like you pointed out, he was not the greatest at any sport. Football was definitely his best sport, and as you mentioned, he was one of the better college football players to ever play. So with what he had accessible to him, he should have never, ever, ever made it as an athlete. He had no chance, and went from a guy who probably got way below average schooling, living conditions, all that, turned himself into one of the greatest athletes of all time, versus Barry Bonds, who was born to an MLB player and basically bred to be an MLB player himself. As great as he was, he had every reason to become that, and every it was, I don't want to say it was an easy path for him, but the path was laid a little bit for him versus Jim Thorpe, who had to truly crawl his way out of the mud to become anything. So
I think when you start discussing greatest athlete of all time, generally my mind goes to a multifaceted athlete, not who dominated a single sport more. My mind always goes to Jim Thorpe, Bo Jackson, those types. If you want to talk about people dominating sport, Barry Bonds, obviously. I think you got to mention someone like Michael Phelps, who dominated the world of swimming more than anyone else ever. Tiger Woods and Simone Biles, a female athlete from America who did in Olympic gymnastics what no one else has ever done ever. So I think those are people you got to throw in the conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with all those for sure.
Fair enough.
I think that'll do it for this one. Thanks everyone for watching. Tune in on the next episode and we'll keep this going.
We'll see you guys next time.
See ya.